Welcome to Summer Camp by No Revisions. This summer, we are talking to our service providers about trends and what it takes to be successful in their respective crafts. Today, we have Nike Aurea, who is an inclusion consultant and educator and works with us on our DEI service here at No Revisions. Nike, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be at camp this summer.
Oh my God, me too. I'm so obsessed with camp. Well, thanks for being on. And if we want to get right into it, I'd love for you to just share a bit about your background and how you started working in the DEI space.
Yeah, I would love to. So, my background is in education. And so, within education, inclusion work is really, really important. That's kind of what inspired me to learn more about how to create more equitable spaces because that's what students need and kids need. And through my experience, through my master program, and then also within the education system, I just recognized that we really needed to continue doing that work that we focus on in K through 12 education in other workplaces, and especially in marketing. It never loses relevancy. So that really inspired me to use my background in education in order to help communities make their spaces more inclusive, whether it's a brand or a small business or organization.
That's awesome. Yeah. So, what has that been looking like for you on a day to day basis?
That really looks like being really intentional about your language, your marketing, and your branding strategies. Because DI is something that major corporations are doing, where they have like these huge departments dedicated to them. Um, it's something that I think also smaller organizations and businesses need to take into consideration in order to allow their branding to have the same impact that these larger corporations do. And so that means through your social media, every single day as you're posting, you're also thinking about how your brand is showing up socially and how inclusive it's being, with like your newsletters or your email marketing. It's just ingrained in all these little things that we just don't realize that these bigger corporations have taken notice.
Yeah, I love that point. And I think that when we're on social media, especially like on Twitter and LinkedIn, we see brands getting called out for not being inclusive enough or doing a bad job. But I don't think we also talk about like, well, who's doing a good job, or I don't want to say like just getting by, but can you kind of talk about some of the common pitfalls or misconceptions that brands encounter when they try to, I guess, push DEI on their social media? Because I feel like it it can't just be something pushed on social media. It has to be deeper within the brand ethos and through their whole marketing plan and just about who that company is. So how can somebody go from, hey, we need to be inclusive and offer diversity in everything that we do, and end up also showing that on their social media marketing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a common pitfall is when it feels like brands and companies are just treating DI and inclusion and diversity as a checkbox to like just have it done or make it seem like it's done, rather than it being a foundational element of their brand strategy. Because it can be a super powerful strategy for your branding. And also, it could be something that has a really important social impact. Um, and so when you're just checking off these boxes when it comes to DEI, it can lead to things like tokenism, where like diverse faces are included in these branding and marketing campaigns, but there's not true representation or input from those communities. And so it just creates more harm. Um, Another misconception I think is thinking that just one DEI strategy can fit all audiences or all brands rather than tailoring your specific audience and brand. And so that's really important too when we're talking about like that social impact. Again, you can create an industry leading company or organization through DEI and through having a DEI strategy versus like trying to try all these different things and see if it sticks. And so it's a really important way, but also a really strategic way to make sure that you are moving your brand in the direction that you envision it, especially with wanting to build a huge and transformative future with your branding.
Yeah, so let's say a brand like has that included in their branding and their brand ethos and who their company is, but they want to, I guess, show that on social media. What are some best practices that brands can take or things that they should be thinking about as they're creating social media content?
I think the first thing is to make sure that you have a diverse team involved in your content creation and your messaging. And diversity looks like a plethora of things, right? Again, it's like not checking things off of like, oh, we need to have someone who identifies as this, and then this, and then this, and then we are diverse. It's again noting your audience, noting your service or your product or wherever you're providing, and seeing, okay, what resonates with our audience and how are we representing them, and then showing that on your team. So that's where your team should be diverse, because then that's going to help you when you're creating those pieces of content and having a really like authentic voice when it comes to your creation, but also like the right perspective needed to make sure that it's in alignment not only with your branding but with your audience. Um, and then also just using those inclusive language and imagery that reflects the diversity of your audience in a way that's again authentic, not trying to implement things that seem trendy but really have nothing to do with your branding, and also not understanding the origins of those trends. um, and then I think lastly, also engaging and seeking feedback from your audience and a diverse community so that you can ensure that your messaging is respectful and accurate and then inclusive.
Yeah, 100%. And something I'm thinking about right now because June is Pride Month, there's a ton of brands that we work with. Well, really every brand, when we're working on marketing or when they're putting their brand, I guess their branding together, it's like, okay, yes, of course we can sell to anyone because we work with a lot of CPG brands, but our main target audience is this person, this age, this race type of thing.
Mhm.
And I think sometimes when we talk about like, oh, how can we support the LGBTQ community? How can we do this? They turn that down sometimes because they're like, that's not our core audience. I'm sure you have
Mhm.
to deal with that sometimes, but like, do you have any pushback on that or for people to say, well, like, that's not our audience?
Yeah, I think that's when intersectionality I think is really important, because just as humans, we have a plethora of identities and interests and values. And so when we kind of put our ideal clients and audiences in boxes, and then we just center those boxes when it comes to our branding and marketing, it can actually be really harmful because people are going to intersect with some of those boxes and then not with others. Um, and so I think that's why having a diverse team too, and understanding that there are intersectional identities within any audience that you have is really, really important, because if not, it really holds you back from reaching people who are probably your ideal client. You're just not able to envision them because you're sticking to that box.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. That's kind of the same thing I talk to people about. So while we're talking about all this, is there any brands that come to mind that you think they are doing a good job at being inclusive?
Yeah, I think Chani, the astrology brand, does a really great job of being inclusive, and their messaging is on par with that. Um, and the diversity of their team and the perspectives you can see not only through their content, but through their email marketing, even through the app. Um, so I think they do a really great job of being inclusive.
That's awesome. So one thing you mentioned earlier was, you know, it's not just about like having diverse faces on social media, but making sure your internal team is diverse and that's who's working on the messaging together and things like that. But when you talk about Channy is in really any brand, like maybe you're working on a marketing strategy or working on a DEI strategy for a company and you're doing a competitive audit or an audit of other brands. Are you looking to see who's on their team on LinkedIn or on their website? Or are there brands that you can just tell by how they talk that, like, you know, it's not just a white girl sitting behind a computer writing this?
Yeah, I think it's both. Honestly, it's really dependent on a couple of things, but I think it's kind of hard to say, but sometimes it's just a vibe, right? Like it's in like an intuitive vibe of knowing, okay, that language that they use, that particular word that they're using, they know where it comes from, they understand why it's relevant versus, oh, they're using it as a trend. Um, in terms of just like solely looking at messaging. Um, but then, yeah, sometimes it's just looking at the team too and saying, like, okay, are you even using? Because sometimes you could have a diverse team, but you're not being inclusive in terms of allowing people to bring their thoughts and perspectives and their lived experience to the table. So you might have a diverse team, but you're not leveraging the minds of that diversity and bringing forward their inclusion and then working to make it intersectional. So, are you using and leveraging um, the folks on your team who bring that diversity as well? Is something to look at too, because again, a lot of times people just want to check the boxes off, but it's like this cohesive strategy that you're working on as well.
So at No Revisions, you know, we work with companies of all sizes, but I would say like at least 50% of our customers are small teams, maybe 1 to 2 people, or maybe just one person that's the founder. Do you have any tips for them of like how they can do this? Should they, is that when they should be contacting you? We need a consultant, or I need a consultant. I'm just one person doing this. Like, how can they kind of manage that until their team grows?
I think also when I'm talking sometimes about teams, right, in like a smaller scope, your audience is your team, your clients are your team.
That's a good
And
point.
so there's definitely a way to do this work, even if maybe your team of employees is a little bit smaller. Um, so asking your audience what they want to see, um, what they value, making sure that aligns with like your brand and your company values, and then using that to work on being inclusive. And I also say you don't have to do it all at once. I think that's when people get really overwhelmed. So starting really small. So like again, if you are getting feedback from your community and they're saying we really want more accessible ways to engage with whatever, then it's a way that you can start implementing a DEI strategy is accessibility. So you might start making adding captions to all your videos. You might start providing image descriptions for your photos, and that's implementing an inclusion strategy because you want people to feel included and have access to your um, social media content. And so that's a way that you're doing DEI, but then also you're taking into consideration the diversity of your community, of your audience, of your people that you're building this brand and company with.
That's awesome. And we talked about this earlier. So a lot of the times if somebody does something wrong, like there's a billion times Target has done things offensive or all these
Mhm.
big companies, everybody's talking about it. But let's say, you know, maybe you're not a big enough brand to get that much backlash and see it. How can a brand measure the effectiveness of their campaign or know that they did a good job on it, or if they did a bad job and they need to improve on, the next campaign or in their evergreen marketing? Is there any tools that can help with that, or is that kind of going back to their audience and asking?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of going back to your audience and asking, but also making sure that you have internal systems to checking for yourself. The most important thing is to be open to feedback, right? So asking your audience, and sometimes you don't even have to ask, right? People will offer their opinion and taking it into consideration, but also having a way to track on your own the work that you're doing. Because at the end of the day, everyone's going to have opinions, and you can only meet yourself where you're at, too. That's why I say start small as well and have a plan for yourself of like how you want to build up to creating a holistically inclusive brand. Um, but it might just be getting that feedback from a diverse audience, and also getting that feedback from your social media tools, right? Like it's tracking certain metrics, such as like your audience diversity. You could track that as people are engaging, your engagement rates, um, and then seeing like the feedback that you're getting through comments and likes and messages. Because the more that people feel seen and connected to your brand, the more they're going to want to engage. And so if you do something like a campaign, for example, to promote having a more inclusive brand and it doesn't have that engagement, that is something that's a little bit more telling, right? Because that means that folks didn't see themselves within that space. And then vice versa, too. If you do something and then people are being engaged and they're connecting more. Um, so you can ask for that direct feedback, but also notice through how people are engaging. Because when people feel seen and safe, they will want to reach out and they will want to show up.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And so I mentioned this earlier, but you do work with us on a few DEI services, from strategies and consulting. Can you kind of talk about the process of like, okay, a brand wants to focus on DEI and kind of bring that into what they're doing for their brand? What is your process like? Are there certain questions that you always ask or documents you want to see from them? Like, what does it look like kind of from start to finish of a project?
Um, First, we start where you're at, right? So knowing like what have you started, what have you tried, what haven't you tried, where are you feeling overwhelmed, what scares you about starting. Really building that foundation of like this is these are all the things that are really important for me within my brand. These are the things I've tried. These are the things I've wanted to try, but I've been scared to try. And then working from there, because it looks different for each brand too. I've worked with folks who like have tried to replicate something that they've seen, or something that they've seen like maybe even another client of mine has done, and it just doesn't work for them because they're not meeting themselves where they're at. Um, so the process really starts there, and also understanding like why you're doing the work you're doing, why you have the brand, why you have the business, why you have the organization, because that's going to inspire you to create this more inclusive, safe space and community, right? Like understanding your values and your mission is also really important. So, like, the first thing I do is look at your mission statement. Or if you don't have one, we're building it, because that's going to also be a foundational space or starting point to create that space, and lead you to your strategy to help make sure that those values and that mission is shining through. And that's the reason why you are using specific language or doing specific campaigns. It doesn't make sense to do a campaign that doesn't match up with your values. And I think that's where sometimes brands kind of get confused and then it comes off inauthentic because it doesn't make sense. And so we want it to make sense. We want it to feel authentic.
Yeah, well, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing all of these insights today. If you want to work with us and with Nike on DEI, you can search DEI on norevisions.co.